August 1945. The sun rose quietly over the blackened frame of Yokohama's train station, painting shattered glass with light too soft for the scars it touched. Allied aircraft no longer filled the skies. The bombs had stopped falling, but nothing felt normal. The war had ended not with a rifle shot but with a voice on the radio. The Emperor had spoken. 23-year-old waitress Keiko Matsuda stood in the doorway of Café Ginza, still half expecting an air raid siren to interrupt the silence. But there was no rumble, no ash falling from the sky. Only the hiss of the tea kettle behind her and the low groan of trolley wheels on warped steel outside. They had reopened the café 2 weeks after the surrender, sweeping away the soot and painting the cracked windows with paper screens. The menu was short: rice if the deliveries arrived, weak tea, no milk, one plate of fish shared among 3. But it wasn't Japanese customers she prepared for, it was the new arrivals. And that morning, the Americans came in uniform. Not as conquerors, not kicking doors or waving flags, but walking politely, ducking their heads beneath the warped frame, some of them even bowing, awkwardly mimicking what they'd read in pocket phrase books. They didn't speak much Japanese. Keiko didn't speak much English. But the moment the first soldier left a crumpled wad of yen, enough to pay for not just his meal, but her family's entire food ration for the week, she knew something else had arrived on Japanese soil. A power not measured in divisions or bombs. A power that didn't bark or threaten. It left quietly with a nod. And it tipped double. She thought it was a mistake. It was. The second day, 5 soldiers came in. Clean uniforms, faces sunburned and tired. They ordered rice and fish. One asked haltingly if eggs were possible. Keiko bowed, disappeared to the kitchen, and scraped together what little they had. They smiled when she returned. One of them tapped his wrist, a signal for thank you maybe, or maybe you were fast. They didn't eat like the Japanese soldiers who used to swagger in with blood still drying on their boots. These Americans shared plates, laughed softly, leaned their rifles against the wall like they were tired of holding them. And when they stood to leave, each of them placed bills beneath their cups, crisp occupation currency. Each left twice the meal's cost. Not out of guilt, not out of pity. Just as if that's what you do. Keiko didn't know the word, but her mother did. Tipping, she whispered, it's their custom. The rumors spread fast. Girls from noodle shops, tea houses, bakeries, all whispering the same thing. They don't haggle, they don't bargain, they don't shortchange. They pay and then pay again. Yuki, who worked near the army barracks, swore one soldier left enough to cover her sister's hospital fees. Another said an American left 2 full ration booklets at the table by accident, or maybe not by accident. Keiko didn't believe all of it. People exaggerate, especially in lean times. But when a soldier came in one rainy afternoon, asked for nothing but tea, and left the equivalent of a week's salary tucked under the saucer, she stopped questioning. It changed the entire feel of the cafe. The owner, old Mr. Ishikawa, who had once banned any foreign customers, now welcomed the soldiers with forced smiles and nervous nods. He had lost a son in Burma, but he also had 3 grandchildren who hadn't eaten meat in 6 months. Money was money, and the Americans, for reasons no one could explain, seemed determined to give it away. They never asked for more. They never stayed long. They tipped, then walked out, leaving behind folded paper and silence. Keiko began watching their faces, not the way girls watch boys, but the way someone studies storm clouds for signs of lightning. Some soldiers were loud, brash, too quick with their laughter, but others, they were just boys, tired boys. One of them, an army corporal with a bandage across his knuckles, sat for nearly 20 minutes without saying a word. He stared into his tea like it contained something only he could see. When Keiko brought his bill, he looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten where he was. He smiled. It wasn't a good smile. It was the kind people wear to hide something breaking underneath. He paid double, bowed slightly, walked out. She found a letter folded under his plate. She never opened it. She couldn't read English. But she kept it in a box with the coins and the tips, like some artifact from a war that didn't know it had ended. By October, the Americans were everywhere. Not looting, not shouting. Walking quietly, respectfully. They saluted their officers. They helped children cross flooded streets. One GI stopped a cart from rolling into traffic. Another gave up his spot in line so an elderly woman could buy rice before it sold out. And every day they came to the cafes, the bakeries, the tea houses. They sat, they ate, they tipped. Always more than expected, never asking for change. Keiko's older brother, Kazuo, didn't trust it. "It's a trick," he hissed one night. "Guilt maybe, or arrogance. They want you to feel small." Keiko said nothing. But inside she didn't feel small. She felt confused. Because no Japanese officer had ever left a tip. Not once, not during the war, not before it. And when they entered, it was with commands. Not questions. The Americans asked for food, not with orders, but with soft voices and hesitant grammar. They didn't seem like victors. They seemed lost. One evening, 3 Marines walked in, soaked from rain. They ordered what little was left, half a bowl of miso, 2 eggs, and some cold rice. They shared it between them without complaint. When they finished, one reached into his pocket, then paused. He glanced at Keiko. She looked away. He pulled out a handful of coins, stared at them, looked back at her. Then slowly placed every single one on the counter. He didn't say thank you. Didn't say anything. He just nodded. And walked out. His boots left muddy prints across the floor, then disappeared into the street. Keiko didn't wipe them away. She just stood there watching the door. And whispered, "What kind of soldier tips double and walks away?" Rain became the rhythm of the weeks that followed. Not the bomb-laden monsoons of wartime Yokohama, but a softer, more hesitant rain that tapped at rooftops and blurred neon signs. It made everything quieter, as if the country was holding its breath. Keiko kept working the cafe, morning to night. She served tea, cleaned tables, and counted out change with fingers that had learned to move quickly, respectfully, without eye contact. Years of war had taught her not to linger. But the Americans, they lingered. They sipped their tea slowly. They didn't bark orders. They waited to be spoken to. Some tried words in Japanese, broken, mispronounced, but not mocking. One Marine pointed at the sugar bowl and asked, "Am I desu ka?" Keiko blinked. He grinned sheepishly. "Sweet?" he asked, trying again. She nodded, almost smiled, almost. He left double. They always did. By mid-October, the American tipping had become more than rumor. It was legend. And it was changing things. Not in big, loud ways, but in the quiet economics of post-war survival. The noodle shop across the station began adding small bowls of seaweed to meals when soldiers came. A tiny tea stall near the docks added cushions. A bakery near the burned-out prefecture building began dusting their rice bread with powdered sugar for the GIs who said it tasted like home. And in every case, the result was the same. Extra yen. Extra food. Extra dignity. Keiko's mother stopped arguing about the Americans. At first, she had hissed under her breath whenever one entered the cafe. Her husband had died in Manila, burned alive when a tank shell set the hospital ablaze. She hated them, all of them. But then a young Navy man, barely older than Keiko, came in one night during a blackout. He sat quietly, didn't ask for much. His boots were muddy, his uniform soaked. Keiko served him a bowl of soup, weak and watery. He nodded thanks. When he stood to leave, he left the payment, and then, without a word, placed a second envelope beside it. Inside was medicine, actual American penicillin, sealed in foil. When Keiko brought it home and explained, her mother said nothing for a long time. Finally she whispered, "I don't understand them." Keiko replied, "Neither do I." A man named Corporal Gaines began coming regularly, always quiet, always polite. He never flirted, never stared too long, but he left notes on napkins in blocky English letters. "Good rice today. Thank you for warm food. I'm sorry for the noise outside." Keiko saved every note. She didn't know why. One night he sat alone near the back, his shoulders hunched. A scuffle broke out outside the cafe, two drunk GIs pushing each other, shouting about cigarettes. Gaines stood, opened the door, and spoke sharply in English. The shouting stopped. The two men slunk away. Gaines returned to his seat, picked up his tea, and drank silently. When he left, he tipped triple. Not every experience was so calm. There were soldiers who drank too much. One who grabbed a waitress's wrist and wouldn't let go until his friend dragged him outside. A Navy man who vomited near the register. A Jeep crew who left with stolen cigarettes. But those men were reported, quickly, and the cafe's owner was surprised when military police actually followed up. A week later, the groping soldier returned, not to harass but to apologize. He bowed stiffly, handed over a crumpled envelope, then left without a word. Inside were 5,000 yen. Keiko's manager looked stunned. "He wasn't ordered to do that," he muttered. "He just did it." They never saw that soldier again. Keiko began to notice something else, something strange. The Americans rarely asked for discounts, even when the cafe had no meat, even when the rice was cold, even when the tea was weak. They paid what was asked, then more. Not once did she hear them complain about the food, or the cracked cups, or the wobbly chairs. In a country where pre-war customers used to measure a waitress's worth by how quickly she bowed and how flawless her service was, this quiet tolerance felt alien and disarming. One night a pair of officers came in, older than most, clean uniforms, polished boots. They didn't smile, they didn't try broken Japanese, they simply nodded and sat. Keiko brought tea and rice. One of them, a captain, judging by the bars on his shoulder, looked at the cracked bowl in front of him for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it gently. A tin of powdered milk. He placed it on the counter, said nothing. When they finished, they paid double and walked out. Keiko stood frozen. Her hands trembled as she picked up the tin. It was real, American, unopened. Her younger brother hadn't had milk in 2 years. Some called it a trick, some called it pity. Some whispered it was a guilt offering penance for the bombings, for the city's turn to ash. But to the people who worked in cafes, tea shops, bakeries, to girls like Keiko, who served strangers for a living, it felt like something else. Not power, not shame. Just decency. A different kind of war. One morning, Keiko arrived early to clean the cafe before sunrise. The streets were still wet with dew, the neon signs flickering from an overnight brownout. On the table by the window sat a folded newspaper, not Japanese, American. And beside it, neatly placed, an envelope. Inside were 3 things. A 500 yen bill. A pocket-sized English-Japanese phrase book. A note that read, "Going home, thank you for treating us like humans. I hope we did the same." No name, no rank. Just the message. Keiko stared at the envelope for a long time. Then folded the paper carefully, placed it in the same box as the letters, the napkins, the coins. She never saw that soldier again. But for years afterward, when new Americans came through, young ones, lost ones with crooked smiles and shy hands. She served them tea without fear. And when they paid double and walked out, she simply nodded. Because by then she understood. They weren't just tipping for the food. They were tipping for something they could never repay. By November, the word tip had become part of the everyday vocabulary in Yokohama, even if no one agreed on the pronunciation. Tipu, some said. Others made it sound like Tibu. It didn't matter. Everyone understood what it meant now. It meant extra rice. It meant medicine. It meant sometimes, in a winter colder than any before it, survival. In Cafe Ginza, the behavior changed long before the menu did. Civilians began mimicking the Americans. They'd leave a few coins on the table, bow a little deeper, say thank you instead of expecting it. Keiko noticed. She noticed everything now. The way a single American soldier could shift the air in a room by walking in quietly. The way their eyes searched for signs, not of danger, but of acceptance. The war had ended on paper, but no one knew how to live in peace. Not really. And so they practiced it here. In small bowls of rice. In quiet gestures. In coins left behind. One morning a woman came into the cafe. Not a waitress, not a vendor, a civilian. She wore a gray kimono, modest and threadbare. Her hands were calloused, her hair tied simply. She looked around, nervous. Then sat at the far corner table, away from the soldiers. Keiko brought her tea. The woman whispered, do they always tip? Keiko hesitated, then nodded. The woman said nothing. She stared down at her tea, both hands wrapped around the cup. Her sleeves trembled. Keiko didn't ask, but when the woman stood to leave, she handed Keiko a napkin. Inside was a drawing, ink on paper, small, precise. It showed 3 GIs sitting at the cafe, laughing, one tipping his cap, another holding chopsticks wrong, the third raising a teacup like it was a beer stein. Keiko smiled. The woman nodded and slipped out the door. The next day, the drawing was pinned behind the register. No one asked who made it. Everyone just looked. And left more than usual. Not all stories were sweet. In December, a young waitress named Tomiko from the cafe 3 streets down disappeared. Gone overnight. No one knew why. The police said nothing. The cafe closed the next week. People whispered. Some blamed the Americans, said she'd followed one. Others said it was Japanese gangsters, black market thugs who ran the docks now, feeding off the chaos. But for Keiko, it didn't matter who was to blame. Because the next morning 2 Marines came into Cafe Ginza, sat silently, ordered nothing. Then one stood, placed a single wrapped package on the counter. Inside was dried fruit, canned meat, and a pair of wool socks. And a note written in shaky English. She helped me find my friend, we won't forget. They never returned. Winter came fast. The paper walls of Keiko's home barely held out the wind. Her brother's coat was patched in 3 places. Her mother boiled the same bones for 4 days to flavor their soup. But the cafe stayed warm. Because the Americans kept coming. And the tips kept growing. Some left coins, others left food. One, a bearded GI with fingers black from engine grease, left a tiny harmonica on the table. Another, a cook from the air base, left an entire unopened bag of coffee beans. Keiko had never tasted real coffee before. She cried at the first sip. They brewed it in secret for weeks, serving it only to the oldest customers, the widows, the teachers, the men who'd returned from Russian camps with frostbitten hands. And every time, Keiko said the same thing when they asked where it came from. A man who tipped and walked out. She learned their names slowly, not from introductions, most never offered them, but from the stitched patches on their uniforms, from the way they wrote on napkins, from the dog tags they sometimes left behind by accident, or maybe not by accident. Names like Ramirez, Walker, Nakamoto, Smith. They came from cities she couldn't pronounce, states she'd never heard of. But when they tipped, they all did it the same way. A pause, a quiet nod, a retreat without fanfare. And when they walked out, they left behind more than money. They left behind the sound of coins on wood, the warmth of a half-finished cup, and the echo of something impossible to name. One snowy night just before New Year's, a fight broke out outside the cafe. Two Japanese men arguing with a young GI, voices rising. The soldier didn't raise his fists. He just stood still, confused, trying to explain something in broken Japanese. Keiko stepped out. Not because she was brave, not because she knew what to say, but because the GI had tipped her every week for nearly 2 months. He always sat in the same seat, always ordered the same miso, always bowed twice before leaving. She placed herself between them, spoke firmly. The Japanese men cursed, spat, and left. The GI looked stunned, then grateful. He reached into his coat, pulled out a pack of Lucky Strikes, and offered it without a word. She didn't take it. She just bowed. He bowed back and walked away. That night, Keiko found something under his usual table. A small leather-bound notebook. Inside were sketches. Pages and pages of drawings, Yokohama's rooftops, the burned railway bridge, the cafe itself, her. One sketch showed her handing him a bowl of soup. Another showed her laughing, though she didn't remember laughing that day. On the last page, a note. When I go home, I want to remember this place as it is now. Not for what we did, but for how we were forgiven. She didn't cry, not then. She just placed the notebook beside the harmonica, the letters, the napkins, and opened the cafe the next morning like nothing had changed. Because it hadn't. Not really. Only the country. Only the war. Only everything. By January, the Americans weren't just customers. They were part of the street. Their boots wore paths into alleys once walked only by vendors and children. Their language, fractured and soft, began creeping into signs, menus, and chalkboards outside noodle shops. Keiko had never expected it to feel normal. But it did. At least during the day. At night, memories of firebombs still crawled through her sleep. The whine of sirens, the heat of a house burning down, the absence of her father's voice the next morning. She never told the Americans that. She wouldn't know how to. But sometimes, when one of them sat too quietly for too long, she wondered if their silence came from the same place. One evening, a new soldier appeared. He wasn't young. His hair was starting to gray at the edges, and the lines around his eyes looked carved by something heavier than age. He sat alone, ordered barley tea. Didn't speak. Didn't even look up. When Keiko brought the drink, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a photo. A black and white portrait of a Japanese woman, holding a child. He pointed to the photo, then to himself. Then folded the image carefully, slipped it back into his coat, and drank in silence. He left triple. Didn't say a word. Didn't return. Keiko never forgot his face. Not every tip was money. Some left gifts, strange, small things, impossible to trade but priceless in their intent. One Marine left a pencil, perfectly sharpened, with the name of a high school in Ohio stamped in gold. Another left a tiny booklet of pressed flowers, each labeled in careful English. One Navy pilot left behind a single cigarette, wrapped in foil with a note. Don't smoke this. Save it for when you want to remember something good. Keiko didn't smoke. She kept it anyway. Her mother stopped burning incense for her father. Not out of anger, not from grief, but because one day, as she sat lighting the sticks, she saw Keiko count a stack of American bills behind the register. That night, she said quietly, he would have hated this. Keiko replied just as softly, he never lived long enough to know what losing meant. They didn't speak of it again. But the incense box remained closed. The tipping changed the power balance. In a society where customers once looked down at servers, where deference was expected, and payment was cold and transactional, the Americans broke the rules. They bowed. They smiled. They left more than they owed. And it confused people. Some elders hated it. We're not beggars, they muttered. We're being bought with politeness. But the young ones, the war widows, the orphans, the boys missing legs and futures, they accepted it. Because the Americans never asked for anything in return. They tipped. And left. No promises, no threats. Just a gesture. In February, a boy of about 8 came into the cafe with his grandfather. The old man wore a veteran's pin. He looked at the American soldiers already seated with visible tension in his jaw. The boy, oblivious, ran to the table near the window, where a sergeant had just stood to leave. "Are you the man who brings the chocolate?" the boy asked in Japanese. The sergeant blinked, smiled faintly, reached into his pocket, and handed the boy a wrapped bar. The grandfather didn't bow, didn't thank him. But as they left, he placed a 5-yen coin on the table. The first Japanese tip Keiko had ever seen. By March, the Americans had started rotating home. Some regulars disappeared overnight. No goodbyes, no farewell letters. Just empty tables, folded napkins, and in one case, a set of dog tags tied around a teacup. Keiko kept them in the box, even if she didn't know the name. On one particularly rainy night, the cafe filled with more soldiers than usual. A shipment of something, no one knew what, had just arrived at the docks, and the whole street buzzed with energy. They ordered food they couldn't finish, laughed too loudly, tipped carelessly. And then, as the last of them stumbled out into the night, one paused at the door. He turned to Keiko, held up 2 fingers, said, "You saved us more than we saved you." She didn't understand the words, but his eyes said enough. He tipped the brim of his cap and walked out. That night, Keiko opened the box behind the counter. She laid everything out on the wooden floor of the kitchen. The dog tags, the pencil, the dried flowers, the photograph of a woman and child, the harmonica, the cigarette, the sketches, and next to them she placed a small note written on the back of a ration stub. "You came with weapons, you left behind paper." Then she folded it all back up, closed the box, and wiped the tables clean. Because the morning would bring new soldiers, new notes, new things left behind. But she would remember the ones who tipped quietly and walked away. By spring, the boxes were full. Not just Keiko's, every cafe girl, every tea house hostess, every vendor who had served the Americans had something they kept now. Not because they were ordered to, not because anyone told them to. Because the war had left behind so much ash, and these small things were the only artifacts that didn't burn. In the drawer behind the tea counter at Cafe Ginza sat 5 photographs, a faded playing card, 7 napkin notes, 4 cigarette cartons flattened like bookmarks, and 37 yens worth of American pennies. They didn't spend them. They didn't sell them. They kept them. Because someday someone would ask, what was it like when they came? And this would be the only honest answer. Not the tanks, not the planes, not the bombs, but the paper, the coins, the quiet walkouts after a meal. In April, an army chaplain came through with a group of officers. He didn't wear a sidearm. Instead, he carried a journal and a book with pages so thin you could see through them. He ordered tea. After a long silence, he asked Keiko if she believed in forgiveness. She didn't know the word. He repeated it, opened the book, pointed. Then drew a circle on a napkin, tore it in half, and pressed the pieces back together again. She didn't respond. But when he left, he placed the napkin on the table and tipped 4 times the bill. A letter arrived in May. Typed official, stamped in red ink. It said the cafe had been requisitioned for military purposes and would be closed for 2 weeks. No explanation, no appeal. Mr. Ishikawa slammed the letter down. "They take everything," he muttered. "Even now when they smile, they still take." But no soldiers arrived. No trucks came. 2 days later, the same letter was returned. A second note was stapled to it, handwritten, rushed. "Ignore the order. There was a mistake. Keep serving." It was signed only with initials. No one asked who sent it. The cafe stayed open. By June, the first true reconstruction crews arrived. Japanese and American engineers together, sweating in the same mud, digging the same foundations. The ruins were being erased 1 floorboard at a time. Some of the soldiers still came to the cafe, fewer now. New ones replaced the old. Young, fresh-faced boys who asked for sugar and had never seen war. Keiko served them, but something was different. They didn't tip. Not always. Sometimes they forgot. Sometimes they smiled and said thank you and walked out with empty pockets. No one blamed them. But the box behind the counter stayed shut after that. Nothing new was added. And that, more than anything, told Keiko that something had ended. Not the war. Not peace. But the bridge between them. In July, a Japanese customer asked her a question she'd been waiting for without knowing. "Why do you still treat them like guests? At least not in uniform." Now they came in business suits, some with briefcases, some with camera bags. They didn't speak Japanese, but when they asked for tea in English, Keiko recognized the rhythm. Not the words, the shape of the voice. And sometimes she caught a name. Ramirez. Walker. Smith. It meant nothing. It meant everything. In early March, a young American couple entered the cafe. He wore a baseball cap. She carried a guidebook in her bag and pronounced arigato with a bright, confident grin. They asked for green tea and rice. They took photos of the lamp, the paper screen, the cracked menu board. And when the man pulled out his wallet, he paused. He placed 2 crisp bills on the table. Then a coin. Keiko picked it up slowly, a 1944 American dime. Worn thin, almost smooth. She looked at him. He didn't say anything. But he nodded just once. And she knew. Later that night, she opened the box again. She hadn't added anything in years. Not because there wasn't more to remember, but because the remembering had grown too large for boxes. Still, she placed the dime gently among the sketches and napkins and pressed flowers. Then ran her hand across the harmonica. It was tarnished now, the reeds no longer sang. But her fingers remembered. That summer the cafe celebrated its 20th anniversary, not with music, not with banners, just a small paper lantern hung outside the door, flickering against the wind. Keiko didn't tell anyone what the lantern meant. But by sundown, 5 former waitresses came through the door. One by one. They sat, they ordered tea. And they all left something behind. A coin. A handkerchief. A pressed flower. A note we still remember. In the fall, a Japanese historian asked to interview Keiko. He was writing about post-war cafe culture, about economics, Reconstruction, American influence. He asked questions in a neat notebook, spoke clearly, efficiently. How much did they spend? How often did they come? Did they always tip double? Keiko answered what she could, then handed him the box. He opened it slowly, saw the letters, the coins, the harmonica, and said, "This is very sentimental." She nodded, then closed the lid. In 1953, a letter arrived from New York. Typed, neat, forwarded by a translator who once drank tea at the cafe during his military service. It read, "My father served in Yokohama. He passed last winter. We found a sketchbook among his belongings, drawings of a cafe, a woman serving tea. My mother says he talked about it often, but never with anger. He said it was the first place he felt human after the war. I don't know if you remember him, but I want to thank you. I don't think he ever forgot." Keiko didn't reply, but she lit a single stick of incense that night. The first in 8 years. Decades passed. The coins dulled. The napkins yellowed. The stories grew quieter. But they were still there. Tucked into drawers. Folded into boxes. Carried in the breast pockets of widows and sisters and soldiers who never spoke of what they'd seen, only of where they ate, who served them tea, and how they left something behind. Always something. And always without asking for change. One autumn morning in 1960, a man stood outside the cafe for a long time before entering. He was old now, thin, his knees shook slightly when he bowed. He sat in the corner, didn't order anything. Keiko approached, poured tea. He placed a photograph on the table. A young man in uniform, a Japanese waitress in a pale blue apron, both smiling awkwardly as if someone had told them to. She stared. He said softly in Japanese that hadn't been used in decades, "You served us like we were guests. I never forgot." She poured more tea. They didn't speak again. When he stood to leave, he placed one item on the table. A folded napkin. Inside, a single fresh-pressed flower. No note. She watched him go. Didn't follow. Didn't need to. The next day, she added the flower to the box. And closed it. Not forever. Just for now. Because even when wars end, some stories keep walking through the door. And even after silence falls, someone always tips. And walks away.